Good evening. Hello. If you're watching this on tape delay, good morning or good afternoon. I am Patrick with Humanities Tennessee, joining you here via the internet to bring you another installment of our 50 books for 50 years. So, for the 50th anniversary of Humanities Tennessee, we are naming 50 books for 50 years on the chapter16.org website. We release 5 titles per month, and we are asking some of our regular writers to choose one title from the list for a deeper retrospective. This month, and what you are about to witness, writer Dean Marcellus has chosen The Girls of Atomic City, the untold story of the women who helped win World War II. So when you're done taking this beautiful lecture in, and conversation in, when you're all through with that, please visit chapter16.org to see the titles that we've released so far and to read the thoughtful essays there as well. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Marcellus. Jane Marcellus is a writer whose published work includes literary nonfiction, critical analysis, and journalism. Her work was listed as notable in Best American Essays 2018, 2019, and 2020. She is a former professor at Middle Tennessee State University. And let's say she's also joining us right now. Here's Jane. Welcome, Jane.
Hi, thank you, Patrick. I'm glad to be here. I also want to thank Maria Browning, the editor of Chapter 16, who asked me to do this, and Serenity Gerbman, who's been fabulous. Before I introduce Denise, I want to talk just for a second about the book itself and why I chose it. So I'm assuming not everybody listening to this has read The Girls of Atomic City, although I highly recommend it. But basically, it was published about 10 years ago, 2013, and it is a series of interviews and research about women who worked in the Clinton Engineering Works at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So one thing I never knew about Oak Ridge until I moved to Tennessee about 18 years ago was that it was put up almost instantly in the 1940s, 1943, confiscated farmlands. They built a city, they built the Clinton Engineering Works, and the goal was to develop an atomic bomb. Most of the people working there did not know that. They went to work every day. They were doing work they did not totally understand. So the whole thing was veiled in secrecy. And eventually they found out that, when the bomb went off at Hiroshima, they found out what they had been doing. So that Denise has pulled together a number of interviews with women who worked there at the time. They worked in a number of jobs. High school girls who were monitoring dials and some of the machinery. She talked about women who developed, women who were scientists who were working on developing the bomb in other parts of the world. So it's about the untold stories of all these women, and quite a good time to do it at they were getting older. So it was kind of in the nick of time that she went and found them and did all these interviews and wrote this book. I became interested in this and picked it off the list because my research when I was a professor at Middle Tennessee State and still is had to do with representation of employed women in the 1920s, 1930s, and beyond. So I had actually done a paper a few years ago on women in the Kaiser shipyards, the Rosie the Riveter women who were famous in that iconic recruiting poster you've probably seen where Rosie's, holding her arm up and being strong. There was a Saturday Evening Post cover done by Norman Rockwell. Those were the women out in the open, but these women were working in secret. They didn't even know themselves what they were doing. So it was kind of a different take. Also, personally, my mom was of that generation. She was a working woman. Her work was not in the in the war industries. But she was very much part of that generation. And so I was interested in that. So that's why I'm here, why I picked this book. But more important than all of that is Denise. So I'll introduce her now. And I'm very grateful that she's here going to talk to us. So our guest, Denise Kiernan, is an author, journalist, producer, host of Craft, Authors in Conversation, which you can find on her website, DeniseKiernan.com. She has a new young readers book, We Gather Together, Stories of Thanksgiving from Then to Now, which arrives next week. It's a companion to a popular adult nonfiction book, We Gather Together, and a children's picture book. So she has a wide range of interests and projects going on. She wrote a book called The Last Castle, which was a New York Times bestseller and also a bestseller on the Wall Street Journal. She lives in North Carolina. So welcome, Denise.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I thought we would do some Q&A, and then I'm hoping that people in the audience will put questions in the chat. So I want to begin with a basic question. How did you come to write this book? What drew you to these women in this time?
I was actually working on another book, and this is often what happens, not just with me, but other, especially narrative nonfiction writers that I know. There's so much research that goes into what we do, and these books are such long processes.
Right.
I'm always keeping lists of ideas and things I'm curious about, and so that I know what I'm going to be doing next. So sometimes I look at these lists and I go, my God, that's the worst idea ever. And then sometimes I look at these lists and I say, oh, that one's kind of stuck with me. That one kind of won't let me go. So I was working on another book and I was doing research. And I was just having one of those days where I was just going down various internet rabbit holes. And I ended up at the Department of Energy website, as one does. And they were having they had a little history post. And it was one of Ed Westcott. Ed was the official photographer for the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge during the war. And they had one of Ed Westcott's photos there of these young women sitting in front of what looked to me to be these crazy, huge machines. I found out later they were Calutrons. And it said these young women were recruited from, many of them in high school, were recruited from all over to help, enrich uranium for the world's first atomic bomb. Many of them would not know what their role was until years later, till after the bomb was dropped. And I thought, okay, that's kind of interesting.
Right.
So I took that idea and, filed it away. And then when I was ready to start pitching my next book to my agent, I went back to that and I thought, I could actually just drive over there and see what's going on. So I drove over to Oak Ridge and just started trying to track down people who had lived and worked there during World War II. And the more I talked to individuals, men and women, and the kids of people who would work there, all that sort of stuff, I realized there was a really interesting way to talk about this aspect of World War II and this aspect of the Manhattan Project specifically. That was a little different than what had been done before. And in all my work and the books that have come out recently, and Last Castle, Girls of Atomic City, We Gather Together, I'm always sort of looking to come at stories in history we think we know, but there are these marginalized voices that we don't always get to hear from. So rather than talking about the Manhattan Project from a very top-down perspective, from the point of view of generals and Nobel Prize winners, which is a fascinating point of view. I mean, I love it myself. I thought, what would it be like to tell the story of the Manhattan Project from the point of view of someone like one of those girls sitting on those stools in front of those big, crazy machines. So I would say, that I came across it kind of by accident, and because I saw a photo, and then, I just the idea sort of wouldn't let my brain go. And then when I started meeting people, I thought, yep, this is what I want to do.
Right. Yeah, I love that picture, by the way. I was looking at your website, and it's there. So so I like that picture a lot. It's worth taking a look at. So my next question was, how did you go about finding the women? But you've pretty much told me.
I can tell you more about
Yeah,
that if you want.
how did they, they were much older. All those girls sitting there were now much older women. How did they feel about talking about it?
It depended person to person. And that goes for the men too, because I interviewed, hundreds of people and men as well. So I contacted a local historian who had worked at Y12, Ray Smith, and I said, you write a lot about this locally. Are there people I could maybe, meet? And he said, yeah, come over to this. I actually went over. It was an assisted living facility, and I was introduced to Colleen, who was one of the first, who ended up being a main person throughout the book.
Right.
And when I met her, what Colleen said and what a lot of people said when I told them I wanted to interview them and I wanted to talk to them about their role in Oak Ridge and in the Manhattan Project, a lot of people, the first thing they said was like, why do you want to talk to me? I didn't know anything. So it was really interesting to me that these people who were obviously incredibly important to this project, it would not have achieved anything without them, really kind of over the years had just sort of devalued their role in it in a sense.
Right.
And but Colleen was happy to talk, and then she introduced me to her next door neighbor, Dot, and then Dot introduced me to Celia, and then I'd go to play bridge. I do all this stuff with everybody, and whoever would talk to me, I listened to them and got as much information as possible. Sometimes I just hung out in the lobby of the assisted living facility, hoping to catch people who worked there during World War II. I offended a few people in their 60s when I asked them if they, worked there during World War II, but what are you going to do?
Yeah.
And, so I just kept tracking people down, but it became sort of a web of connections. So once I met a couple people, that's how it happened.
Yeah. Okay. So kind of a snowball effect situation. So I want to talk a little bit about the women's motivation, because I think there's a sense historically, when we think about everybody in World War II, that people, saved their tin cans for the war effort, and they had victory gardens, and they were very united in helping win the war. And I think that was largely true. But I think from what I've read about that time, looking at popular magazines at the time, there was a lot of talk about patriotism as a motive. And yet, so one time, I was young and I had this World War II era mom, and I said, Mother, why didn't you go work in the war effort? Why weren't you Rosie the Riveter? Like, what was wrong with you? And I didn't say what was wrong with you, but that's kind of what I was thinking at some young age. And she said, well, I had a job. I had a good job. So why would I do that? And it made me think, that the motivation in the popular culture maybe wasn't always the same for everybody, that for so many of them, it was practical. And I think you addressed that. So, so my question is, besides patriotism, what made them do this? Was it, adventure? I know the pay was much better than other jobs they could get. But what did they tell you about why they did this?
Again, it's such a wide variety, thousands upon thousands of people work there. And even among just the sample I was able to talk to, they had varying answers to that. There were definitely some common threads. I think it's interesting to note that the war was ever present in everyone's lives. So it was, songs on the radio were about the war. Superman comics were about the war. You were supposed to gather scrap metal. You were supposed to go to the USO and volunteer. I mean, all of these sorts of things. So there was this prevailing sentiment that people should do what they could for the war effort.
Right.
Many of these women either knew, and this is true for a lot of folks during that time, either knew someone who had died or knew someone who
Right.
was away fighting. A couple of the women I interviewed had brothers who were away fighting.
Mhm.
Some people had boyfriends. One woman had two brothers away fighting, Celia. And so there was that kind of desire to help on a very personal level.
Right.
And then there was the very real economic impetus. So you have folks who, in some cases, grew up in, very, very humble surroundings,
Right.
some without indoor plumbing.
Right.
And a lot of these young women were, nobody expected them to do much. That's not true for everyone. I interviewed
Right.
women who had college degrees and all that sort of stuff who worked there as
Right.
well. But so for a lot of them, it was, my brother died at Pearl Harbor and
Right.
I wanted to get out of my small town and this was going to be a lot of money. And I get to leave and go live somewhere I've never lived before. So it was
Right.
usually for a lot of these folks, a combination of reasons and motivations. But I would say economic need and sort of emotional attachment, personal attachment to loved ones of some sort who were away fighting. Those things kind of combined for a lot of folks and was a very powerful combination. But the economics of it that was a very real reason as well. I mean, the Depression was not a very distant memory for a lot of these.
Oh no, it was just a couple of years, 3 years maybe before. So absolutely. And I was struck by how segregated things were. Jim Crow was very much alive in Tennessee in the 1940s. And the couple from Alabama who had come up, but they had to live apart, even though they were married, because the housing was segregated and there was no family housing. So they couldn't bring their kids. And yet they were motivated by the money. They could send money home to their children who were staying with relatives. And that was both sad and horrible to me, but also I really admired their kind of fortitude and determination. And, that was the woman who had somebody fashion her a biscuit pan and, was found a way to live, found a way to deal with the situation as it was. So that was really poignant to me, those stories. So I find the secrecy really fascinating.
Sure.
And so I wonder, there's Oak Ridge that just wasn't there one year. It was farmland. And the government comes and pushes these people off their family farms and puts up the city. And there's those very vivid descriptions of the mud and how deep the mud was and how the women would have to take their shoes off to walk through the mud or they would ruin their shoes. It's little details like that are so wonderful. But the secrecy, and yet, here you are in this mud, in this place, and you're living in something called a hutment that's plywood, and it's very small. And of course, you're young, and we all live in different ways when we're young. But it's a secret that you can't tell your family. You can't tell your partner if you're married or partnered. You can't even talk about it to the person working next to you, like that next girl up on the stool in the photo of all the stools, because they didn't know themselves. And yet they kept doing it, following directions, doing it right, not really asking, and getting into a lot of trouble if they asked, or the possibility of getting into trouble was always kind of present. So I'm wondering what the women said as older women about that secrecy in their lives. How did they feel about it? Was there a sense when you interviewed them of, oh, we shouldn't talk about this? or was that just gone?
For most people, it was gone.
Yeah.
For some folks, they would start talking, and then all of a sudden go, I can talk about this, right? They sort of like
Yeah.
would catch themselves.
Right.
There was one woman who her son came up to me. I was in the museum doing something, and he said, I know you're interviewing people who worked here during the war. I want my mom to talk to you, but she says she's not allowed to talk about anything. So it's not like at the end of the war, anybody came by and said, hey, you can talk about everything now.
Right.
But one of the keys to what enabled the secrecy to prevail, as much as it didn't, it wasn't a perfect system, was that people were only given enough information to do their specific job.
Right.
So no one knew necessarily what they needed to do, but they had no idea how their little piece fit into the larger puzzle, or even what that puzzle was.
Right.
And this, of course, varied depending on where you worked.
Right.
So in a way, it was designed to not give people information they could share. So that already they weren't given that much information that they could share, but they even weren't supposed to talk about anything that they were doing, or ask about what they were doing, or get curious about what they were doing.
Right.
And, there were, a lot of the young women lived in dorms, which was kind of fun for them, because it was sort of like what you'd think, what they thought college might be like if college had been a plan for them. And, if you're hanging out in the dorm, you can't sit in your room and say, hey, what do you do? Which plant do you work at? I mean, you had badges that controlled everywhere you went. So if you worked at Y12, for example, you couldn't even get on a bus that was going to K25. So there were people corralling you sort of at every turn. And, years later, most of the women just said, well, that's the way it was. That's what we had to do.
Right.
And it's sort of, for a lot of the women I talked to, they viewed it as sort of, well, that was a small sacrifice compared to what my brother was going through in Italy.
Right.
One woman I'm talking about. And it was difficult at times, but also they just needed to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they thought that's what they said. This is what you're supposed to do. You're helping the war effort. And that was enough for them.
Right. I thought it was interesting that the young women were hired because they ask fewer questions, than maybe
for some of the roles. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Then maybe a young man a few years older who'd been to college in some relevant scientific field who might, what are these gadgets and what do they do?
They wanted folks who would be, whether they were men or women, they wanted folks who would do as they were instructed.
Yes.
Without causing a lot of problems. So that's true for the men as well as the women. It's not just the women who went through that. Right. And, even the women I profiled who had college degrees and were working in statistical capacities or in chemistry labs, sort of the same thing. This is what you're doing. It was obviously very different than what the young high school, recent high school graduates were doing.
Right.
But kind of the same rules sort of applied. It's like, this is what you're going to do. Don't worry about what anybody else is doing. This is what you're going to do. But yes, that aspect of obedience, not being a troublemaker. A lot of times when they were getting ready to hire folks, they would have people go to the town and ask, neighbors and teachers, what are they like? Do they get in a lot of trouble and all this sort of stuff? And they would actually do background checks on people that sometimes involve just showing up in somebody's community and starting to ask questions about them, because they didn't want a lot of turnover either. They wanted to get people in who would be able to do their job, not leave, not get fired because they couldn't do their job or they were, talking too much about, what they were supposed to be working on. So everything was about trying to create an atmosphere of control, really. I mean, because they were trying to control information. They were trying to control, the product. So, I mean, having a workforce that could be controlled to some extent was also a priority.
Right. Yeah. It seems like so different from what we might be able to do now. What, when the skies are full of drones and
I don't know.
satellites.
I don't know. Well, you tried flying a drone over the National Security Administration in Oak Ridge. It won't last very long. So I
Oh,
mean,
yeah.
there's still a fair amount of secrecy. It's just very different. I mean, today we'd have some 8-year-old Instagramming the gates. It was,
Right.
because it was a very large project.
Right.
Oak Ridge went from not existing to having 80,000 people and using more electricity than New York City.
Right.
So it wasn't invisible. It was top secret, but clearly people around knew something very, very big was happening over there. I mean, I agree it would be more challenging to operate at that level nowadays, but I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of things we don't know about.
Right. Well, I think part of it was, the media at that time, newspapers had this sort of gentleman's agreement with the government. It wasn't exactly censorship.
Yeah. Oh, actually, it was
kind of like censorship. It was de facto censorship.
Well, there was actually a department. There was a department of censorship at that time during the war. So
Yes,
there was word coming down from literally Washington about what could be said and couldn't be said in newspapers.
Yeah, the Office of War Information, it was called.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they had a list of censored words and phrases and topics.
It was they micromanaged, but they didn't, to not offend journalists, they didn't call it censorship.
Everything was for the war effort.
Yeah,
everything was to
support
make things
war.
better for the war effort. Yeah.
Right.
There were still journalists who, went out of their way to try and find out what was going on, for sure.
Right. Of course.
And there were people who got in trouble because they were writing about stuff they weren't supposed to write about.
Right.
But the line, the whole thing was, please, we're trying to keep things under wraps here.
Right.
You want to be the one who's going to, screw up the war effort for everybody. So they really did play on that idea of doing what needed to be done in order to make this project, whatever it was, because nobody knew, a success.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I was thinking a lot about the secrecy angle. And I was curious about how it played down in generations, because I also read another book, Half-Life of a Secret by Emily Strasser recently. And it's about, her grandfather was a scientist there. And her book is all about how, yes, and all about how that the secrecy affected him and her, down through the generations, including her, and she's a fairly young woman. And what did this secrecy in the family and in the nation do to people? So it's sort of the take of another generation. So I found that fascinating to read it, and that, and read yours along with it, because it's the sense of secrecy doesn't really go away completely. I think that's why she called it it has a half-life. It's fascinating that one of the women would say, oh, I can't talk about that still, because you would just learn that maybe you can and maybe you can't. So obviously,
some of the most gratifying experiences I had after the book came out and, was a bestseller and got so much attention, is that I would hear from people who said, my grandparents never talked about what they were doing in the war till they saw your book. And then they just started talking about everything. So it was in a weird way, for some people, the fact that this book existed opened up, avenues of conversation within their own families.
Right.
But it stays with you, that secrecy, I think, some of the people.
Yes. Right. So I want to talk, and we're running into the time we should shift to audience questions, but I want to ask about women's labor. Your subtitle has the word untold. And so does Margot Shetterly's Hidden Figures, about Black women working in the space race. has that word untold. Why do you think women's labor is untold? Why do we have to keep writing books about people whose efforts, obviously contribute so much?
Well, I think in general, history has always been written and to celebrate the important
Mhm,
people, right?
mhm.
So, and throughout history, and even today to a certain extent, the opportunities for women were not the same as they were for men. So it was a
Right.
combination of the role of women in society combined with the fact that if somebody was going to talk about a historic moment, they wanted to talk about the really important people. And you
Yes.
put those two things together, and then you have all of these marginalized voices. You have,
Right.
women, you have, Black Americans, you have people who come from economically challenged backgrounds.
Right.
Those stories don't get focused on, and it kind of perpetuates itself. I mean, someone who came from, the child of a Nobel Prize winner, I mean, that person's papers are going to go to archives.
Right.
So some of it is just some of it, I mean, it's sadly, it's a reflection of society and what we, seem to value. We value the loudest, most important voices a little more than all of the folks that work and commit and devote their lives to whatever project it is. That this is not just true for, the World War II era. I mean,
Right.
it's true, still true today. So, yeah, but those, I mean, to me, those stories are actually kind of more relatable. I mean, a lot of us can relate to, I'm 18 and I'm going to some city I've never been
Right.
to before, and I'm living in a dorm and I'm going to dances and I have my first paycheck. That's a very familiar feeling to a lot of folks, even if we weren't working on the Manhattan Project.
Yes, absolutely. So one last question for you. It's been 10 years since this book came out. How has your perspective changed? And if you could ask one more question of these women, what would it be?
How has my perspective on the era changed?
Yeah, or on the whole, everything you researched.
Well, I don't quite know what to say. I mean, I think the hardest thing whenever you do books like this, when you do narrative nonfiction and you do so much research, the hard part is all the stuff you have to leave out. I mean, there's deciding what to leave out is always harder than deciding what to put in. So, I mean, I could go back to the same amount of research that I did, like just go get the box out of the basement, and I could write still a very big and a completely different book.
Yeah.
So I think, as a writer, you kind of, even though you've moved on to other projects, you always kind of have that sort of like, maybe I would have done that differently, or maybe I would have done that differently. And
Yeah. Okay. Well, we have lots of questions. So
all right.
Let's see. Is it true that many people did not know the full picture of what was being developed? Did any talk about their feelings? Did any of them talk about their feelings after the bomb was dropped?
Okay. Is that two questions or one? Is that one question?
It's
what
two.
Was the first part of the question?
Well, I think you've answered the first part, yes, many people did not know the full picture. Hardly
the majority
anybody.
of people didn't know the full picture. Men or women.
Did they talk about how they felt after they learned the bomb was dropped?
I asked everybody. I asked absolutely everybody about that. And one of the things I tried to do when I was interviewing them was to get them to talk to me about how they felt on that day, not how they feel now. Not how they feel now, and and now that we know everything about nuclear weaponry and all of that sort of stuff, how did they feel, in August of 1945 when they found out, what they were a part of? And answers varied, the way people varied, and a lot of them, it's a fascinating group of people to talk to because they lived in they lived in two different worlds. They lived in a world with nuclear weapons and a world without nuclear weapons. I have no idea what it's like to live in a world without nuclear weapons.
Right.
You know, in my life, you know, you say the
Yes.
bomb and everybody knows what you're talking about.
Exactly.
You're talking about the atomic bomb. You know, back then, when this first happened, people were saying things like the automatic bomb because just the language wasn't even there. You know,
Yes.
nuclear winter and fallout and all that
Yes.
stuff. That was not even, you know, that wasn't even a part of conversation early on. So,
Right.
you know, some people, when they found out this scale of death and destruction, were very upset. Some people were, well, that's war. And, you know, some people were kind of sort of, I talked to one woman and I think she put it rather well. She said, I remember I was so happy because the war was over and my brother was coming home.
Mhm.
She said, but I felt really sad because a lot of people died and I had something to
Right.
do with it. So
Right.
she felt both things. And I think
Yes.
we have a tendency looking back to say you either felt this way or you felt that way. But the
Mhm.
people who were there, I mean, they're humans. They felt all sorts of stuff.
Right. Right. So we have a comment from Lois.
Hi,
She
Lois.
says, I was so thankful this book was written. I lived in Oak Ridge in the 1990s in one of the apartment complexes built in the 1940s.
Mhm.
Several of the residents had been there since Oak Ridge's inception. I didn't take the time to hear many of their stories and always regretted it. This book was amazing.
Oh,
So,
thank you very much.
yeah.
I really appreciate that. But it's also, I kind of know how you feel. Like when I put my writer investigative reporter hat on, I'm asking people all of this stuff. But often I'll, you know, look around just in my daily life and people I know who are, you know, older than me or have had different experiences. And I think, you know, they need to get an oral history done. They need to, that their story is important too. So
Mhm.
I really appreciate what you're saying, Lois. And I'm always encouraging people to do an oral history and get it in your local library. The Library of Congress has instructions about how to do oral histories in your community. And that sort of information is really important. You know, people's perspectives, not just, you know, as I said, the important people,
Mhm.
you know,
Right.
people's perspectives are incredibly valuable. So I always like to tell folks, if you know somebody who, you know, is getting on in years and, you know, you think, gee, I wish I knew a little bit more about what they're doing. Well, I'm sure there are probably a lot of folks, you know, writers, researchers, educators who would love to have that perspective to add to, you know, whatever moment in history
Yes.
you're looking at.
Right. Thank you. Um, if you visit Oak Ridge today, how well is the work of women from that time represented in museums and sites?
I think they've actually done, I think they've done a pretty good job actually.
Yeah.
And it's changed a lot even since, you know, I don't remember exactly which year now, but I mean, you know, I was going to Oak Ridge at least 15 years ago. And over the years, the museum has changed now. The old
Yeah.
museum isn't there anymore. There's a new museum,
Mhm.
which is very
Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
But there is a much larger focus on the role, not just the role of women, but kind of the roles of those, again, kind of marginalized voices.
Mhm.
So I think they do a pretty good job,
Yeah.
you know.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a great place to visit. I'm always telling people to go. It's a fascinating place to visit.
Speaking a little more about why women's stories of their labor are told less, do you think women interpret things like secrets and secrecy differently from men?
No, I don't. I don't
Okay.
think so. Yeah.
Cool.
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I don't know. Or I mean, maybe they do. I didn't have any personal evidence of that. I mean,
Right.
the men took the secrecy as seriously as the women did, for sure.
Mm.
In my experience with the people that with the people that I talk to. So
Okay.
I think the reason we don't hear a lot of the women's stories is not necessarily because they took the secrecy anymore seriously, but again, just because from a societal standpoint, with the opportunities that were available to women. You know, when World War II was over, they basically said, "Hi, ladies, thanks for helping us out. You guys can go back to the kitchen now."
Right.
And so there was this, you served a purpose. Okay, bye. So it just sort of perpetuated this. What happened after the war is as much a part of why stories didn't get told as what during the war.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, we have about 5 minutes, but one more really good question. Did you see Oppenheimer? And what were your thoughts about the movie, having done so much research on it?
Well, I actually, Rolling Stone asked me to write a piece about it for them, and I did, because there's so much of, because the focus of Oppenheimer, you know, was Oppenheimer and Ernest Lawrence and, you know, and Los Alamos and that whole scene. And, you know, so Rolling Stone wanted the other perspective, you know, the women and the folks who were not in Los Alamos. I loved the movie. I thought it was great. It was, I mean, because you know, you have to, it was long, but I mean, so you know, you have to truncate some things, but he clearly, you know, there was a lot, they were very, I thought they were very true to what went on. There were a lot of little things that I actually thought you would have to, they were so detailed. I thought, wow, somebody wouldn't know who that is unless they had, you know, knew a lot about the project. So what I liked is that, because I actually went the date open, and I went with a friend and his teenage daughter who's big into science. And there were things that they loved it, but there were things that they couldn't tune into just because they hadn't had the same breadth of research that I did. But I highly recommend it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. What are you working on now?
Right now I am, so excuse me. My book that's coming out next week is the young readers edition of We Gather Together. And it's the third part of what I call my gratitude series. And it kind of looks at the history of gratitude and how the Thanksgiving holiday actually became an American holiday, which is not the story most of us were told. And again, a big part of that was a woman who didn't get enough, who didn't necessarily get enough credit. So that's what's coming out now. I am finishing up a book that actually takes place during the colonial era and the Revolution. And again, focusing on folks whose stories you probably, you know, definitely not, you know, John Adams and George Washington and
absolutely.
They're in it, but they're not important. They have to be in it, but they're not the focus. So it's sort of looking at the colonial era and the Revolutionary War through the experiences of women, indigenous people of color, all of that sort of stuff, to just sort of round out the kind of the picture of what that we have of that particular moment in time.
Right. That sounds fascinating.
I like it.
Yeah. That sounds. Do you have a title yet?
I do.
Okay.
I do. It's not going to be out till probably 2025. So.
Okay. Yeah.
But if anybody wants to know what I'm doing and where I travel and when I do events and all that sort of stuff, you can just go to DeniseKiernan.com and sign up for the newsletter. And I tell where I'm at and what I'm researching, and I give recipes.
Okay.
So,
That brings us to just about 7:45. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Jane. Thanks for doing this with me.
Yeah, this was really wonderful. So thank you. So I guess that's a wrap, as they say.
All right. Thank you, everyone.